Here's a little outline of where I've been in the last few years, Steve, as well.
So here's my minimalist introduction. I am so thrilled to share Francis Chapman with the Forensic Think Tank Program in Psychiatry and the Law. And as I was researching my dissertation, doing my lit review, I came across many of her amazing articles, one of which was actually with Patty Hearst saying it's time to revisit criminal cases regarding undue influence. So I'm thrilled to share her with PIPATL. And with that, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you to you and Aaron for tracking me down. It feels like home I didn't know that I needed, but I did. So many fellow individuals with my same interests. So this is just a little outline of where I've been for the last few years. Did my PhD at York University, which Julie probably knows well then as well. And that's when I started looking at brainwashing. My dissertation was called Intangible Captivity, the potential for Canadian defense of brainwashing and the implications for the battered woman. So of course that put a bit of a target on me as somebody who is very interested in coercion. As you can imagine, in traditional mainstream academia in Canada, not many people do what I do, but I just wanted to give you a little view of where I am right now, because I didn't know how many people would actually know where Thunder Bay is. We're just a stone's throw away from Minnesota. We're about 40 minutes from the American border, so we're very, very close there. And I'd like to acknowledge the territories that I am speaking to you now in Thunder Bay are the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation, so I'd like to acknowledge that as well. And I don't know if anybody's actually been to Thunder Bay. I don't know
I
if any of
have.
my fellow Canadians have been through it. Have you?
I have. I lived in Winnipeg for a year and a half, and we would drive through it.
Yeah, so most people drive through Thunder Bay more than anything, but we have this really interesting landmass that we call Sleeping Giant, and that's the slide that I put up there. It looks like a sleeping giant, we were very lucky to get a law school here. There hadn't been a law school in Ontario for 44 years before we opened this new one 8 years ago. We've had one at Ryerson since then as well, but we were so lucky to get this building built in 1909 that used to be a high school, if you can imagine. That is now our law school home. That is just a beautiful old building. And I wanted to say just before we start as well that I wish to acknowledge that I don't want to do anything that's pan-Indigenous, trying to say that all Indigenous people are one way or another, or false confessions are or more likely, or anything to really say anything about Indigenous peoples as a whole. This is merely a starting point, going to a law school that really valued our Indigenous peoples. And that is one of our focus, one of our mandates at the law school is to have more Indigenous lawyers. So I'm so lucky to have a lot of Indigenous students that have gone through these doors in the last 8 years, and have met some fascinating people here in Thunder Bay to try to make things more equitable in Canada. So a real focus to what we've done. And that led me to this paper. So like I say, I've been teaching for 15 years now. I feel it's my calling to be a teacher more than anything else. And I've said to Steve in some of our conversations as well that I find that young people are so much more open to recognizing that coercion occurs and to learning more about it. So I really think it's a way to reach a lot of people to talk about some of these issues early on in their legal career. So I love on your website that you have this quote, "The need for new ideas to enrich the dialogue between clinical and legal realms." And this is really what I've been trying to do for the past 15 odd years, as well as try to link the theoretical to the practical. So some academics don't like that I do that, but I'm very focused on actual cases, what actually happened, what we can see changing within the court system. And we've become a very practical school at Lakehead. that we teach students how to be a lawyer, not just how to write an essay about being a lawyer, which is about all that I was qualified to do when I became a lawyer in 2003. So we really want to get the students doing real things. I make them do a bail hearing, I make them do a sentencing, and the lawyers they go to work for are like, oh my goodness, you've already done a mock bail hearing, for example, and it really is linking that practical to the theoretical. And I think that's so important. Like I say, I started off my dissertation looking at battered women and was extremely interested to find all the ties between prisoners of war and the cycle of violence, the traditional Lenore Walker model of the cycle of abuse, and now more the violence wheel that we talk about when it comes to battered women. So I was seeing that many of the steps that both of these groups of people went through were so similar that I was absolutely hooked at that point, that I wanted to study this more, understand why this was happening. And this led me to the girl in the box case. I don't know if anybody knows this terrible case out of California. My advisor at York University had introduced me to this. A lady named Colleen Stan was kidnapped by this couple named Cameron and Janice Hooker. They kept her underneath their bed for 7 years. So I really wanted to look at this coercion, because at different points during her captivity, she would come out of this box and look after the couple's kids. She'd go jogging. She would jog around the local area. She'd go to the supermarket, do all these things, come back and get into that box under their bed. And sometimes she'd be in there for months or years at a time. And I really wanted to look at, well, what is this? What kind of invisible barriers are there to individuals that keep them in that situation, even though there's no gun to their head? I looked at duress a lot in law school and was fascinated when I read Alan Shefflin's book about cases like Patty Hearst, where there is no gun to your head, and still these people are so coerced into doing some of the things that they have done. And I was interested in those kinds of cases and really became very interested through this case. We had another case in Canada, and all my Canadian colleagues will recognize this, of Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka in the 80s. And they had captured and tortured several young teenagers in their house. Very similar to the Cameron and Janice Hooker situation, but when Janice had come forward in the 70s, there was no question that she was also coerced into this situation, and she never spent one day in jail for anything that had happened. She was present for all 7 years while somebody was underneath her bed, where Carla Homolka in Canada was absolutely vilified. And even today, when I say that I think Carla Homolka should have had a defense, that she was under the control of a sexual sadist since she was about 17 years old, people are like, how dare you even suggest that she is not fully culpable for what she did? I had given my mother my dissertation at one point to read the beginning, and she said, you don't believe in this crap, right? You know, it's something that's very difficult for people to understand, that kind of coercion and doing these kinds of things. So that's what my dissertation was all about, and led me into all these different areas, including false confessions. And I remember reading about 10 years or so ago that the Innocence Project in the United States found more than 1 out of 4 persons who had been wrongfully convicted, which was proven by DNA evidence. This is the problem. We can't always determine what is a false confession and what is not. Was falsely confessed in some way, which led to their conviction. And similar situation in Canada as well, that we have a similar amount of false confessions here. And I really wanted to get involved with the Innocence Project and Innocence Canada. It used to be called AIDWIC, but now is called Innocence Canada. And it keeps coming out that more and more of these situations where there's DNA evidence to overturn a conviction, there is some kind of false confession involved. And this really piqued my interest of, again, why are people falsely confessing? Why is this actually happening? And, you know, I looked into some of the history of false confessions, looked into the American case of Miranda, which is so interesting then as well. And showing that even though it's not what we used to think of being beaten with a telephone book where it won't show by the police, even though that physical violence isn't happening, there's still this amount of psychological coercion that's going on. And in Miranda, they recognize this is equally destructive of human dignity as being physically hurt in police captivity. And understanding as I went through this research, looking at these coerced confessions, that people don't continue to have these beliefs indefinitely, kind of going more into Steve's area of deprogramming and why these people come to understand that they shouldn't have confessed to what they did at that particular time. So this piqued my interest, as well as I can't tell you how many people I tell that I'm involved in this kind of research, and people say, well, you would not confess to something that you did not do. That is completely impossible. I don't know what you're talking about. This can't be something that actually exists. But looking at so many of these legal cases where it happens every day. And even finding the police saying in a self-reported study I got from a few years ago then as well, they even themselves anticipate about 5% of confessions they know are not true. And again, leading me to the fact of maybe we need to do things differently if even police officers are saying, yeah, probably about 5% of people who confess do not confess accurately to what they've done. And particularly, of course, given my background in brainwashing and looking at all these topics, I was particularly interested in this typology of coerced internalized false confession. So not just that you confess in the moment to get out of the room, but that you start to believe what you've actually confessed, that you start to adopt those beliefs into your end to confabulate different factors to that proves that you had done that particular thing that you're saying that you did. They begin to believe in their own guilt. They begin to offer explanations for what might have happened in the situation and why they might not have memory of what's going on. And it's funny, I try to look at as many transcripts as I can of different confessions, and the language is so similar between these of, I guess I did it, I must have done it. It's never saying, yes, I did this crime, this is what happened, but I guess so, I guess I don't understand. There's very similar language that's used in these situations. And it sounded so much like thought reform, prisoners of war, all of that old research that I had done on prisoners of war and battered women, but the language was so similar in these different situations that, again, I needed to look more closely into this. Now, I wasn't sure how many of you would be familiar with the case of Oikel. This is a Canadian case. Anybody heard of this one before?
No.
This was kind of the touchstone in Canadian law for wrongful confessions that really has developed where we are today in Canada when it comes to these kinds of confessions. And this was an individual, Mr. Oikel was an arsonist. He had set fires to buildings around where he was in Nova Scotia, including his father's car and his girlfriend's car as well. So when he came in to talk about these crimes and what had happened, he was given a polygraph. And again, polygraph is not admissible in Canadian law, was not told this. All he was told is that you have failed this polygraph that you have taken. He was given this pamphlet about a polygraph test and told to sign it. He had this extremely long interview before that. So the police were getting all of this information out of him. He did not know that he was necessarily the suspect in this crime, which is what he became after a very short period of time. He did this very short polygraph and, of course, was told that he failed this. And what was interesting to me in this case is that it reaffirmed that police trickery is okay in Canada. Again, something that shocks me. They said, short of something that would shock the community, I always wonder what that would be. And we have an old case of Justice Lemaire talking about in Rothman saying that if a police officer pretending to be a chaplain or a legal aid lawyer or injecting truth serum into a diabetic under the pretense that it was insulin, this would be something that we think would be beyond the boundaries of what police can do. And I always bring this to the attention of students and say, is this happening? Is this something that, is that really the line that we draw, that anything less than truth serum is going to be okay for the police to interrogate these individuals? Very shocking to me that this is what came out of this case. And again, we have a situation where this crime that Mr. Oikel had done was very much minimized. And this is one of those techniques that the police use, and that has been found to lead to some false confessions of, this is not that serious. You know, if you just tell us right now, you can go back to your life, you can go home. This is not a big deal. You're somebody who perhaps needs help. They had identified Mr. Oikel as somebody who might be somebody who had a problem with arsons. They said, look, we'll get you help. We'll get you psychological help. This is something that you need help with. And the Court of Appeal found this really odious, to have police officers sitting there and saying, you're a sick person. We are the ones that have access to this kind of psychological help for you. Let us help. Of course, the police did nothing to supply any psychological help whatsoever. This is one of their tactics, simply to get Mr. Oikel to confess to this kind of crime. Court of Appeal was really very disturbed by that fact. Then again, Supreme Court was not. They had also threatened, we will bring in your fiance, we'll bring charges against her. Again, there was no thought that the fiance had anything to do with this situation whatsoever. But when it comes to promising something to someone when they're under this interrogation, we can't always judge what will be the biggest factor for them. And for Mr. Oikel, it was, leave my girlfriend and my fiance alone. That's all that I wanted of this situation. Again, Supreme Court said, not such a bad thing. And the polygraph, well, police are allowed to use some trickery in what they do. Then again, sure, they didn't tell Mr. Oikel correctly that this couldn't be used in a trial against him. They didn't have to show him that he actually had failed this polygraph. They could make up whatever they wanted to in that situation. And yeah, probably they exaggerated something of what was going on with that polygraph and what it actually meant, but we're going to allow it. And again, this was shocking to me in 2000 that we would allow police trickery. We would allow these things. And this is something that has very much been what has informed police interrogations in Canada, which I find very shocking. Just a tangent, I also study Mr. Big situations. This is something that is not done in the US, but it's something that the RCMP have got very good, sorry, my printer's making noise, have got very good at doing, of saying, we have the gang kingpin. We're going to go after some of these people we think that have done minor crimes, sometimes more major crimes. And we're going to say, do you want to join our gang? All done by the RCMP, all done set up. None of this is true at all. They go to this individual and say, if you want to join our gang, you have to really impress Mr. Big. So tell us whatever murders you've done, tell us what robberies. And these people a lot of the time are like, oh crap, I haven't done anything that bad, end up making up things. And we call this a Mr. Big sting. And all those confessions are used against that individual. Wow. Do you want to impress somebody in this gang situation and might make things up? We're not going to listen to the 25 other times that you said, no, I didn't commit that murder, when you're trying to impress somebody. And the RCMP is spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on these kinds of stings. So, in Canada, we've gone to the next level of saying the police can do pretty much whatever they want if we're excluding truth serum. All right, so I have all this basis in Canada, and I'm like, okay, I want to look at false confessions. And one that I want to look at is Sheriff Paul Ingram. And I don't know if anybody had heard of him before. I saw this mentioned in one of my articles I sent as well. This was in the 1980s at the height of the satanic cult scare across North America, that satanic cults were out to get us. And I'm like, I want to see that person who has the most intimate knowledge of the legal system and see if they can be coerced. And Paul Ingram just totally called out to me. He'd been a sheriff for decades. He was actually arrested within his own riding. He knew all the officers who were interrogating him at that point too. There's all kinds of things on the internet about him. A short film that was made in 2013, just a fascinating case. It was in Olympia, Washington, that Sheriff Paul Ingram was there. Really interesting video about him as well. So in 1988, we have his two daughters, who weren't really very young. They were 22 and 18 when this all came up, Erica and Julie. And suddenly they were at a retreat that had to be a religious retreat. They started crying when the person who was leading this retreat asked if anybody had experienced abuse. And they ended up confessing to these people at this religious retreat that their father had abused them for years. They also ended up accusing their brothers, every other police officer in town, anybody that they could think of. But that first and foremost was their father, Paul Ingram, as doing horrible sexual abuse to him. And as they talked to Erica and Julie, they discovered that there was this satanic rituals that were going on. And Erica and Julie supplied all these details about these satanic rituals. Now, Paul Ingram was subjected to 23 interrogations over a 5-month period of time. He was detained, hypnotized, which I'm so interested in hypnotism as well, provided with graphic crime details. And you see this so much in so many of these false confession cases, that the police are really feeding this information that they have. He was told by a police psychologist that you usually repress these kinds of crimes. He just had to really think about it. These crimes would be revealed to him. And they actually had the minister of his church come in and say, we all know that you've done this. Just confess to what you've done. Tell us about these different satanic rituals that you've been involved with. And by the end of this, the girls had outlined about 450 cult meetings that they said that they were involved with. They would, in graphic detail, describe the sexual assault and torture that they had been subjected to. And again, when you have somebody like Paul Ingram, who, when confronted with this, said, I have no idea what's going on. But after 23 interrogations, he started saying, well, my daughters are honorable and they wouldn't lie. And these are the statements that he kept making, that, well, if my daughters say that I did, I must have. Maybe I've repressed this in my memory. Maybe I really don't remember. Maybe this is something that will return to me, and ends up confessing to these horrible satanic crimes that his daughters are outlining. Again, the language that Paul Ingram used, I found very interesting as well. He would say things like, I know from what they're saying that the incidences had to occur and I had to have done these things. Again, not saying, yes, I committed this crime. Yes, I was at this satanic ritual. I have to have had done those things. The detective would go on and question him about that. And all he would say is, my daughters don't lie. I've raised my daughters to be very truthful about what's going on. This is somebody who's a sheriff. This is somebody who's been trained in interrogation techniques. This is somebody who knows the inside and out of the legal system. And we have him confessing to something. Later on, he tried to take back, and somebody made a comment when we're chatting at the beginning of this presentation, that, having this individual then saying, I wrongfully confessed, I want to take that back, that isn't true. Research shows that by the time that goes to a judge and jury, they convict about 80% of those who confess to the crimes. Whether they take that confession back, whether they say, I did it under duress, I don't know why I said those things, they will be convicted in about 80% of those cases that go to trial. So we have somebody like Paul Ingram, who knows so much about this system, still falling victim to this and talking about the coercion that he was under. Really interesting book called Remembering Satan about this case as well. And the fact remains, even though Paul Ingram went to jail for a significant period of time, there was not one piece of evidence of these 450 cult meetings. There was no evidence that the other police officers were coming to these cult meetings at their house. There was no scars. The girl said, if you looked at my body, I have scars on every inch of my flesh. They've done these things, forced abortions, just absolutely insane things that they were talking about. When they eventually had their bodies examined by a doctor, there was absolutely no scars on them whatsoever. There was no evidence. They said babies were killed on a regular basis all the time at these satanic situations that they were at. The land where they led the police to had not been disturbed whatsoever. It was checked over. There were no babies that were buried in that land. Very interesting. Paul had previously been hypnotized by his father in his past. I'd love to know more about that as well, which they wonder if that led him to be coerced more than another person might be. But he received a 20-year sentence for this. Even when he went before the court and said, I take it back, I shouldn't have confessed to this, the judge had no interest in listening to what he said whatsoever. And since he was released in 2003, he has not spoken to the media since he got out. And I'd be fascinated to know more about him and why he had confessed in a situation where there was zero evidence of any of this happening. Another case that I talk about within my article as well is about Billy Wayne Cope. And again, another very sad case. His daughter, 12-year-old daughter, was raped and murdered in his own house while he was there. So it looked very bad when the police came to investigate this. The doors were still locked. Billy Wayne was there, again, interrogating him over long periods of time. We see all those telltale signs.
Lost you.
Sorry?
I said you blanked out for a minute.
Oh, sorry. I hope I'm back now. Everybody here? Okay. So Billy
Yes.
Wayne Cope had been in the situation where his 12-year-old daughter had been murdered in his house, again, over a series of interrogations. Billy Wayne Cope was somebody who went to college, somebody who had an education. And again, I wanted to look at these individuals who knew these kinds of things about the system and were caught within it anyway. He ended up recreating and allowing the police to film him, showing how he had raped and murdered his 12-year-old daughter. Absolutely no evidence it was him. The way he said he had strangled her from behind was not the way that she was killed. And there was no DNA match between him and the semen that they found on his 12-year-old daughter. Few years into this process, after Billy Wayne Cope had given a full confession, he later on said, I thought the police would figure it out. I thought they were really smart. I thought, I'm just going to say it for now, just to get them off my back, and I can go home and they'll figure out that it wasn't me. Again, so much of these cases, you see this faith in the justice system that is just completely misplaced, but he really thought, okay, they'll figure out it wasn't me. The prosecutors in this case were so convinced that it was Billy Wayne Cope. When they finally captured a serial rapist from the same neighborhood that Billy Wayne Cope had lived in, who had the same MO with 12 and 13-year-old girls in the same neighborhood. He was breaking into houses and doing this exact thing. They had tested then the DNA that they had from those crimes with Billy Wayne Cope's daughter, and it was a match. You would assume that the prosecutor would think, oh my God, okay, we got the wrong guy. This was a false confession for whatever reason. But instead of doing that, they said, Billy Wayne Cope must be in a conspiracy with this other guy. He must have let him in. The other guy was the one who raped him, but Billy Wayne Cope is still our guy, and kept him in jail. There was quite a few petitions trying to get Billy Wayne Cope to be released. They had actually wired up Billy Wayne's wife. She was very, very ill with cancer at the time. They had wired her up and sent her to the prison to say, okay, we have a DNA match, and it's a match between your 12-year-old daughter and your DNA. They know you did it, just fully confess. They sent her to the prison house to do this. She did that, not knowing that this was a complete lie, that they didn't have DNA that matched in that situation. And she ended up dying a few weeks later, and never knowing that her husband was not a DNA match to the DNA that they found on the daughter then as well. Again, they were so convinced that they wanted Billy Wayne to be the one who had done this. They even questioned the other serial rapist in this case when he was on the witness stand and asked him about this. And he's like, people keep talking about this Cope guy. I don't know what this Cope guy is. I've never heard of him in my life. You know, when you have the actual person who's committed this crime saying, I have no idea who this other guy is, we still cannot get a false confession thrown out in these cases. And the very sad part of this, and as we mentioned, all these cases are very sad. Billy Wayne Cope had tried for years to try to appeal this, to try to show that he wasn't the one responsible for his daughter's death, but very sadly, he died in prison. He never was able to fully clear his name and had died when after that last appeal was unsuccessful. So again, we have somebody who's educated, we have somebody who knows the system, who is still being caught within this and having this displaced faith in the system that will serve them. And I found these cases really interesting. That was the first article that I had written in 2015 that I believe Steve had sent around to you as well, if you're interested in any more details of those cases. But I was approached in 2016 about being an expert. And, this was kind of my girlhood, all the things I wanted to achieve in life came to fruition in this case. I really wanted to show that false confessions do happen and how we have to treat them very seriously, and was so lucky to be retained on this particular matter. And I'm able to talk about it openly because this matter actually went to court in this situation. So in open court, it was acknowledged that I had done a written report as an expert on this particular case as well, after reviewing hours of videos and transcripts. And it was really great to get to see actual videos of these confessions that had happened in this case, because there is such a focus on body language in a lot of these cases. It was much more easy to see the inflection, what was actually meant when you got to see the actual video of what had happened in this case that simply didn't show up on the page for transcripts. I had submitted that expert report, and they had actually called both detectives in this case to talk about how they interrogated the suspect. And it was literally settled on the courtroom steps hours before I was supposed to be called as an expert. So I didn't have the opportunity to be qualified as an expert, which all my childhood dreams then left me as well. But I was so happy to see that this person was released after we had shown some of the things that were wrong with this confession that had happened. The good thing for me in my research is I had access to all the transcripts of the cross-examination. Such a talented lawyer that I got to deal with that absolutely fabulously cross-examined these detectives to get out what they're thinking about these interrogation techniques that I want to study even more. And again, they knew my expert report was there, and they had information about what was in there. And the real thing that I wanted to talk about was this myth that everybody's equal under the law. People are falsely confessed for all sorts of reasons, and I've looked at lots of them as well, but I really wanted to look at this case in a bit of a different way. It all starts with this REID technique, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the REID technique of interrogation, but I wanted to know more about how the police are trained, what they do in an interrogation situation to kind of determine if what they were doing was something substantiated by science, for example. So I got very deep into the REID technique. It started in the 1930s and 40s with this individual named John Reid and his colleague Fred Inbow. And sometimes you see it referred to as the Inbow technique as well, who is a professor at Northwestern then as well. And this has been called one of the most influential and widely used police interrogation procedures in North America. So these are the techniques that are used every day up until the present day right now. 1962 was when the first book about the REID technique was released, but this has been revised multiple times over the years. I think the most recent was 2015 that they had revised this. Very similar techniques right through from the 1930s to today. And at first, the REID technique was seen as this situation. It's much more humane to interrogate through words than the rubber hose, the phone book that we had seen before in police interrogations. So some thought it was a very positive step forward at times, but it's very similar to the general outline that's been the same for almost 100 years now. So I want to look at this. If we have over 500,000 law enforcement and military personnel in North America who've learned this technique and taken this training since 1974, I wanted to know what this was. I looked at the Ontario Police College, what they were being trained with in 2015. The REID technique was still front and center about what our new recruits are learning about this. Even though there has been an absolutely outpouring of criticism about this technique in academic circles. And, you know, this technique is all based on the fact that this is going to go in predictable stages. We're going to dissuade that person is going to fight back. They're going to say that they're not guilty of that. And the investigator has to push back on that. And there's this mental debating that's going on until the interrogation subject says, yes, absolutely, I did this. So really, to me, this sounds like Columbo is what the REID technique really wants this to look like, that you come and say, yep, absolutely, it was me, that's what's happening, we've had a mental debate, and you, Columbo, win. So to me, this doesn't seem like something that we should necessarily still do, but the REID technique is out there. It's being taught to officers all over North America. A lot of money is being made over the REID technique and its training of very many people as well. So it's still out there in these 9 steps that they go through. So I'm not going to go through them all in detail by any means, but I was able in my expert report to actually go through each of these 9 steps and show how this person that had been interrogated in this case had been taken through each of these steps. What I find really interesting is when we first brought it up that the detectives in this case were using the REID technique, they're like, oh, no, we're really not using the REID technique. We use our own thing. But it's funny how much of this that the detective actually used the language of the REID technique. For example, that theme development, when the detectives were in another room talking about this, that was recorded in the transcripts as well. And they said, well, did you get the theme? Are we doing the theme? They had even referred to the interrogation subject and asked him if he knew what paralinguistic behavior was, which of course this person who was being interrogated couldn't care less about what paralinguistic techniques were, but this is something that comes out of the REID technique. So they were actually using those same terms. And again, I want to look at our law enforcement personnel being trained inadequately. Is this just based on testimonials and anecdotes? And the answer seems to be yes. And this is where a lot of that criticism comes from. They have resisted peer-reviewed studies for the most part. This is based on anecdotes and, you know, having no firm scientific evidence that this leads to more confessions, better confessions, less false confessions. None of that has been proved with the REID technique. But again, we seem to be turning a blind eye to a lot of this evidence then too. The thing that disturbed me almost the most in this is I kept seeing references in the updated REID technique to say, well, we're only using this technique against somebody that we're reasonably certain is guilty. How at that early point when you decide I'm going to use the REID technique to interrogate this individual, how is that a possible thing that you're going to say, well, this is only for guilty people? Well, that sounds to me like they've already made up their mind whether this person is guilty or innocent in this technique. And it's the worst kept secret. There's all kinds of articles everywhere saying how badly received the REID technique is. And, oh, well, we use it in Canada. I guess that's what's going to happen. I was a little heartened that I saw that one big group that had taught the REID technique traditionally and actually bought the rights to the REID technique from the REID people decided to no longer teach it. So one training agency in the States in 2017 decided not to do it. But I don't know if any of you have seen that brilliant Netflix it was a 4-part series on the case of the Chicago 5, and said the REID technique was used against these 5 boys who were accused of doing this terrible sexual assault in the Central Park in New York. And they had talked about the REID technique and said the REID technique has led to these false confessions in that 4-part series. The REID people actually sued the director and the movie for saying that this had led to false confessions. And they said this absolutely does not lead to false confessions. And it is wrong that it's been universally rejected. Well, I can tell you, I've read so much that this should be universally rejected. Thankfully, that lawsuit was dropped in the last year or so. All right. I want to just highlight a couple things. I know my time is getting short here as well, but looking at this nonverbal behavior is such a huge part of the REID technique, showing that we can tell who is guilty and who is not by their posture. We can tell Am I still there? Yeah. We can tell from this paralinguistic behavior how you behave, whether you're guilty or not. And I'm like, well, what kind of cultural differences do they recognize? And again, with having me at Lakehead being so, involved with Indigenous issues and having this in this expert report, this person was Indigenous that I happened to be talking about who had made this false confession. So I'm pouring through all this REID technique information. They have one brief statement that Eastern cultures don't like to make eye contact. That is the entirety in the REID technique that they say about culture whatsoever. And absolutely no mention is made of Indigenous subjects whatsoever. And knowing what I know about different Indigenous suspects, and there was a very famous Canadian case of Donald Marshall in the 1980s. And I'd learned about this case when I was an undergrad, and they found him guilty because he was looking down, because of silences, because of things that culturally were foreign from what we expect as a Western court system, that I thought, this is a thing of the past, but it's absolutely not a thing of the past. When we look at the REID technique, we're looking at things like silence. Many Indigenous people feel that silence is a very real part of communication and feel very comfortable with silence, where lots of us, and any of us who are professors, any more than 2-second silence, we're like, oh crap, nobody understands a word of what I'm saying, I need to do something else. That is not culturally true in other situations then as well. I had found this author named Diana Eads, who I just think is fantastic, who is doing a lot of linguistic behavior and body language research, and saying that in Australia, silence in Indigenous communities is a very legitimate nonverbal way to communicate. And just simply because we don't understand it in the court system or in an interrogation, we're taking this the wrong way. And again, we think silence or looking down or looking up is things that the REID technique tells us is evasion, ignorance, confusion, insolence, all of these things that might not mean what we think that they mean as well. Diana Eads had actually done this study and found in courtrooms, Indigenous individuals had silences up to 23 seconds that they felt completely comfortable with, that they were thinking about questions that had been posed to them, that they communicated in a way that silence was very much part of that. But for us, judging it from a Western point of view and using the REID technique, are missing the entire point on that. Another thing that I started to look into was gratuitous concurrence. And I know nothing about this, and I'm no expert on linguistics as well, but in many Indigenous cultures, it is not only appropriate, but the polite thing to do to say yes to any positive question that's posed to you. What happens when you look at this on a transcript? This Indigenous suspect is saying yes, 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 yes to all these things are being posed, but that is a polite thing in many cultures to do, to agree with what's being posed by a person in authority then as well. But no real confirmation is taking place. But we take that, we put it into a written transcript where we're not seeing what body language comes along with that, and saying that somebody has confessed to something that they absolutely have not done. So I pulled out some gems from different versions of the REID technique, but still very much used today. Things like the REID technique talks about low cultural backgrounds. What the hell is a low cultural background, and why should we even be, talking about this in this technique that police are being taught? They talk about someone who's being interrogated as being on somewhat lower moral plane than us. The REID techniques talks very much in us and them, of guilty and not guilty subjects. It requires one to look straight in the eye, again, culturally, and Indigenous suspects and other cultures as well. This is considered a sign of disrespect, not of telling the truth, like the REID technique is saying. And it depends on people taking over the interrogation, that they should push back and say, I absolutely didn't do this. I'm going to take over. I'm going to show you my mental acrobats, and I'm going to show you that I'm innocent. Again, this might be very rude in many cultures to even attempt to do this. We're allowing lies and trickery. We know that from Oikel. And in this case that I had with this individual, they said, have you seen CSI? Well, we are exactly like CSI, and we're back at that house getting every piece of evidence, and we're going to have 500 pieces of DNA that says you did this crime. Again, not doing that, not having that, using things like religious and moral reasons of, don't you have to answer to a higher power? Again, to me, that's an odious thing to try to convince somebody to confess, and in some cases falsely confess, using those kinds of reasons. And again, the REID technique is saying that somebody looking at the ceiling is signaling resignation, and talks about things like the suspect's eyes being evasive or shifty, cold, hard, strained, or sneaky. This sounds like a 10-year-old, wrote some of these comments that are in the REID technique again. And again, there's so much studies that say body language experts, and I hope nobody is a body language expert who's here today, but some studies have shown that you're no more likely to be able to tell whether somebody is telling the truth or not than throwing a dart at a dartboard and saying who's truthful and who's not. So I went through this in this case that I had then as well, looking at the cross-examinations of these detectives then as well. And they really exemplified every problem that I saw with this technique then as well. It was a 6-hour interrogation over two different periods of time without food, water. The suspect in my case was so cold that he'd actually put his arms inside his t-shirt. He was obviously, again, looking at the video, very uncomfortable. He was denied a right to reconsult with his lawyer. They were using language like paralinguistic behavior that was clear that they did not understand. And one of the things that I was most upset about is that the individual in this case had said something in Ojibwe, which is a language that is very common in Thunder Bay, of a combination between Ojibwe and Cree. And when he said that, the officer just jumped down his throat and said, "What did you say? What did you say? You said something in Ojibwe. Tell me what you said." And just even the way that somebody's traditional language was being treated in that situation was so alarming to me. They had told him he was going to get beat up in jail because of what he was telling them. He had looked down. I think I counted about 46 times. They said, "Don't look down, don't look down. Why aren't you looking in me in the eye? Look at me in the eye right now. Your story is totally full of shit. We don't believe a word that you're saying." Going through each of these categories of the REID technique that I've talked about then as well. So it really did a good job of kind of looking at what this looked like in reality. Again, I was so disappointed that it didn't get qualified as an expert in that situation, but I was really thought it was important to bring together the theoretical and the practical in this situation. And again, what do we do about this? I just want to finish with this thought. Diana Eade says we just don't need an interpreter. We need a translator of culture. We need a support person in that room who's translating, who can say, they're not looking you in the eye because of these reasons. They're, answering this way. Silence is something that this person might be very comfortable with as well. But she identifies that even though this is supposed to happen in Australia right now, it's not happening as much as it should be. But this could really help Canada reach our goals of reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples if we actually had a support person who was there. There's other techniques that are available. It's not like the REID technique is all that we have, but I just want to end there.